Hello, welcome back to Climate Tech Talks, where we discuss environmental problems affecting both the world and APAC. My name is Sam Cook, and as always, I am joined by Thomas Corbin and Velichko Yanchev.
Hey, Sam.
Pleasure.
Right. Today, we'll be discussing the summary of the Tesla Master Plan, or Sustainable Energy for All of Earth. This was published on the 1st of March 2023 and is the third part of their master plan, or a proposed path to reach a sustainable global energy economy through end-use electrification and sustainable electricity generation and storage. This paper outlines the assumptions, sources, and calculations behind that proposal. Now, the actual plan itself is over 160 pages long, so we won't be going through everything, just the high-level details in this talk today. So, Velichko, do you want to take us through the three main components of this?
Yeah, so the plan goes into a lot of detail as to how sustainable energy economy actually can be achieved. And there are three high-level parts to it. So electricity demand, number one. The report forecasts the electricity demand of a fully electrified economy that meets the global energy needs without any fossil fuels. Number two is the electricity supply. It constructs a least cost portfolio of electricity generation and storage resources that satisfies the overall energy demand, electricity demand. And then the third main point is around material feasibility and investments. So the plan goes over what we actually need in terms of materials, raw materials, how we can source them, and what will it take in terms of investments.
You know, just sort of touching on those points, the report was actually quite positive, especially in terms of, what we have available could make this sustainable energy economy pretty technically feasible. And, with less investment and less material extraction than if we just continued, life as normal with the fossil fuel economy, there is actually a pathway to be sustainable by 2050. And whilst actually other studies have come to the same conclusion, this study, it was quite good in the depth that it went into in terms of things like material intensity, manufacturing capacity, and the investment across the different energy sectors.
Right. Yeah, one of the key points that we can cover it, we'll probably cover it later on as well, but one of the key points that jumped to me is the fact that it will cost roughly 60%, or it will cost 40% less to go fully sustainable and create a fully electrified economy. And the estimate they gave is something like 10 trillion of investments over the next 10 years, or over the next 20 years, versus 14 trillion if we were to just continue with a fossil fuel-based economy. So very, very significant differential between the amounts required.
I mean, just for our listeners, 10 trillion is about 10% of the world's GDP at the moment?
It's about half of China's GDP. I believe last year China was around 17, 18 trillion, and the US was about 23, 24 trillion.
Yeah.
So give or take.
So we should have the budget for it in the next 20 years.
But that actually brings me up to something I want to talk to you, both of you, about. So one of the things the paper mentions is the current energy economy is wasteful, and it makes a very large play for energy efficiency. So just for our viewers to understand, energy efficiency is actually seen as one of the primary ways that we can decrease our emissions, or one of the ways. And in fact, the International Energy Association said that during 2020 to 2021, energy efficiency increased by about 2%, and on average increases by 0.5% per year. But this is to do with a investment from 2017 to 2022 of about $1 trillion, give or take. I believe the numbers vary depending on source. But the Tesla report actually goes into a lot more details about how we can actually increase this efficiency substantially, not at our 2% or 1% annual, but significantly more. So I was hoping Tom and Velichko, you guys could go into this a little bit more and how they envision this radical change, considering that we're already put in over $1 trillion into energy efficiency over something like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the upgrades in energy efficiency won't be about building whole new systems around the world, but they'll be about upgrading the existing systems. But one of the really one of the really impressive things that this report highlights is just the sheer wastage in energy that is going on with a fossil fuel economy. For our listeners, the basically in 2019, the total energy supply of the world was about 165 petawatt hours for the whole year. And actually, only about 36% of that energy was actually produced useful work or heat for the economy. And that's unbelievably inefficient. Whereas energy that comes from sustainable sources it tends to be on average much more efficient at producing energy.
Yeah, and it's the key point is if you continue with a fossil fuel based economy, essentially 2/3 of it ends up being wasted, and it's not a useful electricity or heat. In a sustainable electrified economy, you have nearly 100% useful electricity produced. So if we were to transition to a fully sustainable electrified economy and away from a fossil fuel based economy, you actually need a lot less energy generated in the first place, because now you're not wasting 2/3 of it, but you're using everything that you generate. So you only need about half of the energy generated in order to power the entire world with an electrified economy. So you need something like, at the current numbers, less than 80 or around 80 petawatt hours to power the entire world in an electrified economy versus 165 petawatt hours with a fossil fuel based economy that we currently have. So was quite opening to me as well.
I guess we should a little bit explain how much energy a petawatt is, right?
Yeah.
So let's use an example. Let's say you have your normal light bulb, 100 watts. So 100 watts means you're using 100 watts per hour. A petawatt is 1,000 trillion. So that means you're taking your light bulb and then you're increasing it by 100 billion. And that's 1 petawatt per hour. And we use 165 of those every year. So significant. Or
we generated it, but we ended up using only about 37 because 37% because 63-4% or nearly 2/3 of it was produced, but because of all the inefficiency at the source of production, as well as all the stages through which
it goes through, like internal combustion, natural gas burning,
burning, all that. A lot of it goes away. So you actually running it very inefficiently.
No, that's really interesting. So we already mentioned the investment required to basically change our structure, but one of the primary things that people always talk about when we talk about a fully renewable system is the amount of land and the amount of energy storage we require. So can we talk a little bit about this? And also, there's been a few talks about the amount of new materials we need for mining it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that that people try to criticize about solar and wind is it would require this huge amount of land and it would never be feasible. Well, actually, what this report finds is only 0.2% of the world's land would actually be required to transition to a sustainable economy. And that's not a lot of land. When you think that the amount of land we use for agriculture is 12.5% of the world's total land mass, it actually ends up being minuscule.
And on the other key points, the report goes through a lot of detail as to exactly what materials are needed to power this transition. And the finding is that you actually have everything is already there. So there's no shortage in theory in terms of raw materials. The bottlenecks are more in the extraction and the refinement of those. So in theory, we have everything we need. It's just a matter of scaling, manufacturing, extraction, refining. If we were to do that, we can power the entire economy with half the energy versus the current status quo.
All right, so let's move on. We've talked quite a lot about renewables and how much it will cost. Well, this is a Tesla report, right? So I feel like we have to talk about electric vehicles, don't we? So let's talk about electric vehicles. How do they play into this?
Well, of course, it is Tesla. That is the second point in the report, which was what change would happen if we switched to electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are so beneficial because they're about 4 times more efficient than traditional internal combustion vehicles. And that's due to a few key points. Number one is a higher powertrain efficiency, regenerative braking capabilities, and optimized platform designs. And that tends to hold true regardless of the type of vehicle that you're talking about, be it light-duty trucks or passenger vehicles.
Right. Okay, and I'm guessing there's also a little bit of an additional benefit that you don't waste as much to heat, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
electric powers motion much simpler.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about transport, we've talked about energy usage and production, but what about actual end use when we use it? Things like cooling or heating, stuff like that. Does the report go into this and how this could work?
Okay, so we've touched on electricity generation and powering the grid with sustainable energy as the first key ingredient to transitioning to renewable energy economy. Second point was electric vehicles, so moving from ICE vehicles to electric. The third point is around heating and cooling our buildings. So the Tesla Master Plan 3 proposes switching to heat pumps in residential and business, in residential as well as business and industrial buildings. How would that work? And what are we replacing? What are we replacing with heat pumps?
Great question, Velichko. So the idea of a heat pump is pretty simple. It's basically for residential units, instead of using gas for your stove, well, not for your stoves, but instead of using gas to heat your homes, you basically just use hot air. So the idea here is electricity can heat things in general. We're all aware of how that works. You know, like think of your electric stovetop. But it can be a lot more efficient than gas usage, and it doesn't produce methane, which natural gas primarily is composed of, or a lot of natural gas is created from methane. So the idea is we just use hot air in order to heat up our homes. And there was actually a lot of support for this in the middle of last year, especially in Europe, due to the very high increase in natural gas prices over the Russia-Ukraine war. So in general, heat pumps use about 3 times less energy than gas furnaces to heat about the same amount of area. So that's the whole idea.
Okay, so we've discussed a sustainable energy transition. We've discussed electric vehicles, and we've discussed adding heat pumps to people's homes. What's the next point of the report?
So the next one is industry. And industry traditionally in other studies has been seen as one of the hardest areas to decarbonize, because usually in industry, steel, concrete, or whatever, you require very high temperatures, generally well in excess of 200 degrees Celsius. And in some cases, you're approaching temperatures of nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius. Now, to get these very high temperatures, usually we burn fossil fuels, right? That's a given, makes sense. However, what we can do is we can also create heat just directly from electricity. So if we did this, what we would probably do is we would eliminate around 9 petawatt hours a year of fossil fuels and create an additional 9 petawatts of additional electrical demand. That electrical demand can primarily come from renewable generation. One of the big areas where we're looking at this is actually in hydrogen production. So currently hydrogen is 96%, or about 90 to 96% of hydrogen is created from natural gas through a process called steam methane reforming, which is extremely polluting because you release methane into the atmosphere, which has a very high global warming potential, GHG potential. What we're actually looking then is by using increased amount of electricity demand through a process called electrolysis to create this hydrogen, just separating the molecules. So we can create this without any emissions. And the primary thing that we're looking at, one way is through the excess renewables or curtailment. One of the main things that we're looking at as well is how hydrogen and batteries can fuel the transition for longer forms of transport. So this is country to country, continent to continent, either through airplanes, but also in the logistics sector for large ships.
Yeah. So both continental and intercontinental ocean shipping can be electrified by optimizing design, speed, and routes to enable smaller batteries with more frequent charge stops on long routes. In respect of planes and air travel, short distance flights can be electrified through optimized aircraft design and flight trajectory at today's battery energy densities. And the exciting part is that energy densities improve every year. As far as longer distance flights, which are estimated as 80% of air travel energy consumption, these can be powered through synthetic fuels generated from excess renewable electricity, leveraging the Fischer-Tropsch process.
And there's other ways of creating synthetic fuels. So, for example, carbon and hydrogen can actually be sourced from biomass. And eventually, we're hoping that more cost-effective methods of synthetic fuel generation will become available over time, but also that higher density of energy batteries, exactly as you said, could also be a replacement for these forms of transportation. And going on to the last point, how can we actually manufacture the economy as a whole?
Right. So this does mean that we need to scale up our current deployment significantly if we want to be 100% sustainable by 2050, and we need to do it fast. So the numbers we're about to give you are all the numbers that we need to scale up for by 2030, as according to the report. So the first one is our renewable deployment, primarily solar and wind. It needs to be basically 3x what our current level is. So that's about 1 terawatt hour of capacity per year, which is just under the current amount of energy infrastructure in the United States. I believe the US runs at about 1.2 terawatts of fossil fuel infrastructure. The next one is the storage of batteries. So that needs to be 29 times our current levels. And then our electric vehicle production needs to be 11 times more, which was something like nearly 80 million electric vehicles per year.
Pretty big numbers.
Pretty big numbers.
Okay, so we mentioned at the beginning that by transitioning to a fully sustainable electrified economy, we're going to be much more efficient in how we use the energy, and therefore we're only going to need half as much energy to be generated in the first place in order to power the entire economy. So if we were to transition to a fully electrified economy, this would lead to a lot of reductions in fossil fuels.
And the report breaks down for each of its points, what could be the fossil fuel reduction. By far, the biggest would be repowering the existing grid. That would provide a 35% reduction in fossil fuel usage. Next would be installing heat pumps in people's homes. That would get an additional 22%. Transitioning to electric vehicles would be a further 21%. All those industrial processes and producing green hydrogen, that's hydrogen with renewable electricity, that would be 17%. And lastly, providing synthetic fuels and electric batteries for planes and boats would be the last 5%.
So that was the Tesla Master Plan 3. Do we have any other comments?
Yeah, I think the key thing that jumps out to me is that this is really achievable. It's realistic. We have the resources and the potential investments are not as large as some may think. In fact, as we pointed out, it's much more efficient and cost efficient compared to just continuing what we're continue to do, which is unsustainable anyway. So you have to move away from it. So yeah, that's I would say it's very encouraging, and it's not very obvious. I think most people think that this is something that will take a lot more money, a lot more time, that we don't have the resource or the materials. And this Master Plan 3 lays out in very detailed, methodical way exactly the steps that you have to go through, how you're going to get there, and just leads to a much more efficient, much less wasteful, sustainable future, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, one point that we didn't touch on in the report was that they do go into pretty good detail on the breakdown of exactly how many minerals, these rare earth minerals, that we'll actually need to do this transition. And by far, there is enough, lithium, cobalt, whatever. It's fine. That doesn't seem to be an issue. The thing that I sort of worry about is how much we need to ramp up production in the next 10 years to be able to meet these goals, and whether there'll be the political will to do it. I hope so.
Yeah.
But some of those numbers are quite big.
Yeah. If I'm being honest, that's my concern as well, because we've been having climate meetings since, I believe, like Rio was 1994, and we just had the 2022 was climate meeting, and the 2023, I think, 2021 in Glasgow and 2022 in Egypt. And we still have large numbers of these vested interests. For example, Saudi Aramco is one of the world's most valuable companies by market cap, and the oil majors' revenue last year was exorbitant. I think Shell, for example, not even revenue, but I think their profit was over 100 billion last year. So
it was.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, this is not going to go away anytime soon, right? So it is a transition. So nobody's saying that, hey, we should not have any fossil fuels generated, or we should stop drilling for oil, or, I mean, I guess there are people who are calling for that. I don't think that is feasible economically. If you were to do that, you just completely kill off the economy. You don't want to do that. But the point is, it is a transition, and you're going to have oil and gas used for many, many years to come. The point is, this lays out the plan, how you transition away from it into a more sustainable, cheaper, more efficient, less wasteful economy, and it just makes it abundantly clear that it's very much achievable, and it's within our lifetime.
Right.
Yeah, it was nice to see those two numbers. 14 trillion if we stay on track with our fossil fuel economy, and 10 trillion if we switch to what they propose, a sustainable economy.
Yeah.
It's actually cheaper in the long run.
Yeah. That was promising, and that actually ignores the job creation associated with it as well. If you completely change how your energy is produced and increase manufacturing of certain components, you'll create a lot of jobs. It wasn't mentioned in the report, but I think in a previous study, just the APAC region alone, if they were looking at a full transition to sustainability, was 80 million jobs, 85 million jobs over next 2 decades or so.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of the takeaway, right? It's achievable. And Tesla, yes, Tesla is just one company, but they've got a lot of smart people working for them, and this is their proposal of how we can actually get there. And I think that wraps it up.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, I think what they're doing is they're not saying that this is what we're going to do, and this is something that Tesla on its own can achieve. They're putting out all the numbers to all the various stakeholders, governments, policymakers, private businesses, wealthy individuals, everyone who has interest in making that transition and making money out of it, as you say, creating jobs out of it. And yeah, it's going to require huge amount of investments. It's going to require hundreds, thousands of companies across the supply chain, from extraction, mining, extraction, refinement, production of batteries, vehicles, various end user products that we need in order to power this. It's going to take decades. This is not a 5 or 10 year plan. This is a multi-decade plan. But it's it just sets it out very nice and clearly what it would take. And it's I guess there's no excuses not to embark on that transition.
Yeah. And we missed out a few other good points from the report. The idea of AI optimization for a lot of these things, a lot of the routes, but also in terms of mineral extraction. In the future, once we've built all the batteries we can, and they're basically in place in our economy, we don't necessarily need to chuck them away and buy new batteries. We can just reuse and recycle the ones that we have.
Yeah.
So
it's a really critical point. Number of sources suggest that, and I've heard many industry experts talk about this. You can recycle up to 98% of the materials that go into the battery. So the lithium, the cobalt, the iron, all the useful materials that you go through this tremendously difficult, energy-intensive, labor-intensive process of extracting. Now that you have them in usable form, you can just recycle them many, many, many times. So essentially, once you have all the resources required to power the economy, electrify the economy, you only have to do it once. Then you can just keep recycling them many, many times, because essentially all the materials can be recovered, almost 98%, almost 100%. So that's super, super exciting, and it's the opposite of what we're doing now. Like every year, you have to get the same amount of natural gas or oil to power the economy. And it's just not sustainable. It's just not efficient.
Right. So basically, moving away from a 1-to-1 consumption ratio
to a circular economy.
Yeah. Well, that's
the other thing to end today. I thought it was quite funny that after all our discussion with green hydrogen, Tesla admitted that it's going to be a part of the future. So I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching and listening.
Thank you, and feel free to reach out with any comments or questions.
Bye.